Hey folks, this is Tony from Fret Buzz. Wanted to go over today some techniques regarding the left-hand legato style. But I felt that there's always something kind of really neat and fluid about left-hand legato style. I first learned this by watching players like Alan Holdsworth, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, and these kind of really interesting flurry of runs that I would hear in their playing. For many years, I could not figure out what they were doing until I kind of learned a couple of tricks and techniques regarding what legato really is. So a quick definition, legato basically is a fluid style, a fluid series of notes. The opposite, of course, would be a staccato, which means that every note is really kind of accented with a heavy kind of stroke. Legato notes just tend to run together. So a really good example of a legato run would sound something like this. Now, in that quick example, you'll probably notice that my right hand was very inactive. One of the lessons I kind of done in the last couple of days, session I had with Alton Aiden from Never Elected, we talked about an adaptive right hand style technique, which means that I've kind of just used change-ups in my right hand to reflect different musical situations. And all of those right hand work techniques I've always used. My right hand I've always used for more of like an accent part. So primarily I've been a left hand player for most of my guitar playing career. And, for that reason alone, I would say that there is, the right hand can have its own focus for accenting, which we can deal with on another lesson. But if you really want to get into left-hand techniques and how left-hand techniques really work, let's really identify a couple of key factors in having a really fluid legato style. Number one, as I mentioned on a previous podcast, every finger must be involved. I watch a lot of players over the years where they tend to kind of really dominate on a certain kind of finger or a set of fingers, primarily the third finger or the second finger, for good reason, because there's a lot of bending situations where the third and second finger take a lot of precedence, for instance, and vibrato techniques in the first finger. But the pinky is always kind of a finger that's been weaker for many players. Well, I learned many years ago in the legato fluid run style that the pinky finger actually has a lot of power and a lot of positioning speed to make the other fingers kind of work together. So one of the things I've always taught in lessons is the following, that your anchor fingers really are the first and fourth finger. Okay, the first finger is always there for stability on the string. So in this particular, let's say, example I'm using an A, 5th fret, top E string. My first finger is going to hold that note down. And if I, let's say, create a series of notes, I'll just use this out of the G major scale or an A minor, depending on what mode you want to come from. I'll use an A, a B, 7th fret, of the first string as well, which I'm actually going to hammer with my third finger. And then here we go. The fourth finger is actually going to take the C, the half step higher on the 8th fret. Now notice what's going on here, that as I hold the two fingers together, let's say my first finger is there for anchoring, then I would hammer in for the third finger on the B. As I'm kind of putting these positions down, I'm not jumping. I notice a lot of times guitar players will do this kind of thing. You kind of heard that as you come off the string, you create this inadvertent pull. We want to avoid that because we actually want to create fluidity and stability with the left hand. So we hold the fingers down as we run. Okay. Now notice that as these two fingers are together, my fourth finger is pretty independent. I can actually use a hammer and pull only from the third and fourth finger independently, as so. And what we're always trying to strive for, no matter what finger we're looking at, is a lot of power. So what that means is we actually hammer pretty hard. There is some debate out there regarding legato style, if we really need to hammer as hard as we do. And sometimes we hammer, we hear a lot of overtones, and there's a bit of truth and validity to that. But keep in mind that the more we hammer, we get actually more like a pick stroke. We can, in a way, emulate a lot of the staccato we're hearing in picking just by hammering really heavily. So we don't really lose that definition of staccato in a legato style as long as we have some power. So, notice the sustain and how everything really works together. But here's the important part. So we have the stability of the fourth or the first finger. We have the power of the pinky finger here. And on the way back, we have an equally strong pull. When I pull, I actually pull down and away like an arc. If we can kind of see from this angle here on all fingers. Okay. Now, one of the Other techniques that we think about when it comes to really having a lot of movement in legato is not only just having this anchoring technique of the first and the fourth and the power of the first and the fourth finger, but also what we call the fourth finger cross. Really important idea. So what happens in the fourth finger cross is as we move through, let's say, a descending run, in this case, C, B, and A, pulling off, what a lot of players will do is as they cross to, let's say, the string below them, in this case, the B string, all the fingers come off the board, and they actually use a pick stroke on the second string to start the sustain, which then begins the backwards legato. In the fourth finger cross, we don't need the pick stroke. Beautiful part, right? Actually, everything is controlled with the left hand. I actually will stroke just the first note, or maybe I don't even have to do that. Maybe I can just use a hammer-on to start my first note. Go for my pulse on first string, and here we go. Fourth finger actually jumps to the B string, hammers hard. In this case, the G, which is on the 8th fret, second string. And then I reposition both of my fingers, my third finger, my first finger on the F sharp and on the E, same fret number, 7th and 5th fret on the second string, and complete the run. Okay, so what we got is this idea on 6 notes. Cross and move. Do that again. So cross, that's how the fingers go in position. One more time. Cross hammer. Okay, and up to speed. Now we can take that same cross idea and we actually can move it through a scale. So I always use this as an example coming out of the G major, the Ionian scale, or again, if you want to call it the E Aeolian, depending on what mode we're looking at here. So we have really just one accidental, the F sharp, the whole way through. In our third 3-note per string patterns, which these work exceptionally well on, going to our third string, we're using a fourth finger cross to the D, 7th fret of the G string. Then we reposition our fingers to the C, 5th fret, and then to the B, 4th fret. So we get this idea now coming from the first string. Cross, cross. Okay, and we continue that same idea moving through the entire system of notes in that G major mode. Watch. Cross, hammer, pull, pull. Cross, hammer, pull, pull. Continue. Cross, pull, pull. Cross, pull, cross, pull. Now, it's important to note, too, something we can kind of talk about at a later lesson, that you'll notice that my muting techniques are pretty important here because I'm not getting a lot of noise. And the reason for that is also the third finger stability. When I'm actually hammering and pulling, when my first finger hits the fret of that string, I'm making sure that I'm fretting only the note that I'm using for fretting purposes. The rest of the flesh of my first finger is actually creating a block on all of the strings below it. So that means that whatever I'm using in a pull-off, sometimes the fourth finger can pull a lot of noise out. So I just use kind of a mute in my right hand to show you the percussive idea there. But it's important that we have a fourth finger mute across the strings. That way there's no sympathetic ringing on the strings that we just covered. So here's the entire scale in using that fourth finger cross idea. Up to speed. One more time. Okay. Now, if you want to go ascending, kind of same idea, but we don't have really the fourth finger cross anymore. We have a series of hammer-ons. Same thing happened there. You may have noticed I picked only the first note, the G, hammer, the A and the B. Again, all my fingers stay down. And when I move towards the next string, I actually hammer on the C. Same thing, hammer on the F sharp. Next string, hammer the B. No right hand, by the way. Next string, hammer the E. And last string, hammer the A. And then reverse. So if you want to create a nice fluid ascending, descending, we have this. Now, of course, with some accenting on the hammer-ons going upwards, you can always just do this technique. Notice again, I'm not using a pick. One of my last discussions about kind of getting rid of the pick stroke for manipulating my right hand, but of course you can use a pick. Same kind of idea. And then descending. Okay. One last thing here with the legato. To make these runs really sound good, I mean, it's important to kind of do this practice in a singular scale form, but we do know that really good guitar players, play a whole neck approach. Another thing that I've really adopted over the last couple of years in my own playing is to get away from patterns and really think about intervals on the neck. If you do your modal studies, you'll notice that there are always, 7. Well, actually, it depends on the number of scale tones you're using to create a mode, which again we can get to in a different time. But traditionally speaking, your diatonic system uses a 7-modal idea from Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Each one produces a different scale pattern across the neck. What we teach in the studio is that all of these mode patterns can actually link together like a jigsaw puzzle, creating a really wide scale system across the entire neck in a diatonic key, which then you can move and transpose to other keys. Well, the legato system is really neat because what you can do is once you learn to link those notes together, I'll play notes in the E minor scale, the Aeolian, or if you want to call it the G Ionian major, depending on how we tonicize it. And I'll just use some legato ideas to kind of show you how the techniques work. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm moving through positions on one string, incorporating sliding as part of that legato again. There's a cross, slide, hammer, now pull, now slide up to another position, hammer, hammer, slide to a new position, and so on. Okay, so maybe I'm just kind of moving around here, but let's try something a little quicker, a little more controlled. Okay, so again, this legato system is pretty neat because it gives a really kind of slinky, fluid idea across the board and allows you to kind of move quickly in and out of multiple positions that are there. But remember that you want to control the noise. You really want to develop the strength in each of the 4 fingers using various exercises. And it actually serves as a really nice way to just kind of get out from the legato sort of accents that we hear a lot in standardized picking. So again, practice on some of that, try some